It was just another ordinary day, or so it seemed. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the quiet streets. For most people, this time of day might bring a sense of relief as the rush of work began to wind down. But for one man, what would happen in the next few minutes would forever alter the course of his life. His name was unfamiliar to the officer behind the wheel of the patrol car, but the moment their paths crossed, the man's identity would become something far more than a simple driver's license number. It would become a symbol of something far greater, a clash of power, race, and justice. The officer, his hand steady on the wheel, was already mentally preparing for what he thought would be a routine traffic stop. It was a common thing, something he had done hundreds of times before. But the car in front of him, moving with a confident ease, stood out. It wasn't the car itself that caught his attention. It was the driver. His gut told him something wasn't right. Was it the way the car swerved ever so slightly, or maybe the tinted windows that looked just a bit too dark? Whatever it was, the officer made the decision. He would pull him over. Without hesitation, the flashing lights erupted in the rearview mirror, cutting through the soft, golden light of the setting sun. The driver's heart skipped a beat. Not from fear, but from an instinctual knowing that this moment, like so many before it, could escalate in 1,000 different directions. As the officer approached, the scene seemed almost surreal. Here was a man of authority, a figure accustomed to issuing commands and taking control. And here was the other man, a figure just as much a part of the system, a black judge who had spent years sitting in courtrooms, making decisions that shaped lives, deciding who would be held accountable, and who would be given a second chance. He had seen it all. But nothing, he knew, could have prepared him for this. The officer's hand rested on his holstered gun, a movement so small but so telling. The judge's mind raced. He had been pulled over countless times before, but this was different. This officer, with his weary eyes and sharp stance, didn't know who he was. He didn't know the judge's title, didn't know the cases he had presided over, the people he had convicted or set free. To him, the judge was just another black man on the street, a target in a system that had long been designed to question and control him. The tension between the two men thickened. The judge could feel it in his bones, the unspoken history, the weight of centuries of injustice that loomed between them, and yet he stood there, calm, composed, an air of dignity surrounding him. But that didn't stop the officer from making the first move, his voice breaking the silence. "Do you know why I stopped you?" The judge's response was measured, cool. "No, officer. I do not." The officer's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. Was the man nervous? Why wasn't he showing the usual signs of panic that came with these encounters? He wasn't acting like the others, and that made the officer uneasy. His hand tightened on the radio, his thumb hovering over the button. This was the kind of stop that could escalate quickly if things went wrong. But the judge, he didn't flinch. He stood his ground. His experience in the courtroom had prepared him for moments like this, moments where words became weapons and every move carried weight. He knew the stakes, and in this moment, they were higher than either of them could fully understand. The officer continued his questioning, trying to throw the judge off balance. "I noticed you made an illegal turn back there. Did you know that?" The judge's face remained unreadable. "I did not make an illegal turn, officer. I followed all traffic rules." The words hung in the air, thick with accusation. The officer's eyes narrowed, suspicion clouding his judgment. This wasn't going the way he thought it would. He had expected the usual shuffle, the nervous apologies. Instead, the man standing before him remained resolute, like he was in control of the entire situation. The officer's mind raced. What was this man hiding? Who did he think he was, standing so tall and composed, refusing to play along with the script that had been written so many times before? There was something about this situation that didn't sit right with him. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. This was supposed to be routine, easy. But the judge was not easy to intimidate. He wasn't going to be another statistic in a system designed to tear him down. The officer asked for his license and registration, his voice less sure than before. He couldn't help it. There was something unsettling about the way the judge held himself. This wasn't just a man in a car. This was someone with authority, someone who held. The judge reached into his glove compartment, moving with an eerie calm, as if he were in no rush, as if he had all the time in the world. His hands were steady, precise, as he handed the officer the necessary documents. But as the officer glanced at the name on the license, a jolt of recognition shot through him. The judge's name wasn't just any name. It was a name that held weight in legal circles. It was a name that had been on the front page of newspapers, a name that had made headlines for being part of some of the most high-profile cases of the past decade. And now, the officer realized, he was standing before someone who wielded power in ways he had never imagined. For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The officer's breath caught in his throat. What should have been a simple traffic stop was now something far more complicated, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was in over his head. But it was too late to back down now. He had already committed to the moment. The officer hesitated. His hand hovered over his radio, unsure of what to do next. The judge watched him closely, sensing the officer's shift in energy. Something had changed in the air, something that neither of them could ignore. And then, just as the officer was about to speak, the judge did something unexpected. He remained silent. But his eyes, the way they locked onto the officer, spoke volumes. In that single moment, the judge didn't need to say anything. He didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to make a dramatic gesture. His gaze alone was enough to remind the officer that this was no ordinary man. He was a man who had seen and done things that most people could only dream of. He had power, yes, but more importantly, he had the knowledge of how to use it. And that was what scared the officer the most. The tension between them grew heavier, more palpable, as the judge took another step back into his silence. The officer knew that this wasn't just about a ticket. It wasn't just about pulling someone over for a minor infraction. It was about something deeper, something that neither of them was fully prepared to confront. And as the seconds stretched on, it became clear that this moment was going to change both of their lives forever. The officer opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he found himself questioning everything he thought he knew. Should he let the judge go, or should he press on, perhaps hoping to justify the stop in his own mind? What would happen if he made the wrong choice? What if this moment, this brief, fleeting encounter, was the one thing that could spark something far larger than either of them could handle? The judge waited, calm, his posture unbroken, but his eyes never left the officer's. And in that charged silence, the officer made a choice that he would regret forever. The officer's fingers trembled slightly as he reached for the radio, but his mind was already racing. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Every instinct told him to act, to follow through with the procedure, but something about the judge's calmness unsettled him. It wasn't just the man's demeanor, it was the unspoken challenge in his eyes. The officer had faced 1,000 different situations in his career, but none quite like this one. He cleared his throat, trying to find his voice, but it came out softer than he intended. "I need to run your information," he muttered, almost as if apologizing, his hand still hovering near his radio. His gaze flickered to the judge's license, still clutched in his palm, the name printed in bold letters that seemed to glow under the harsh streetlight. The officer didn't recognize it at first, but the more he stared, the more a nagging feeling gnawed at him. He'd seen that name somewhere. But before he could ask any further questions, the judge spoke, his voice calm and unwavering, cutting through the tension. "Is there a problem, officer? Is there anything else you need from me?" The officer hesitated. He had a duty to follow protocol, to keep control of the situation. But the quiet authority in the judge's words made him question his next move. In that moment, the officer felt like he was standing on the edge of a precipice, unsure whether to step forward or retreat. His gaze dropped back to the name on the license. Something clicked, but the connection wasn't clear. Not yet. He adjusted his stance, straightening up as if trying to regain some semblance of power. I just need to confirm a few details, he muttered, more to himself than to the judge. His hand still hovered over the radio, ready to make the call, but every second felt like an eternity. The quiet between them felt unnaturally loud, and he couldn't shake the sense that the judge was waiting for him to do something wrong. And the officer wasn't sure if he had the courage to do it. The judge, meanwhile, there was a calmness in his posture, a sense of quiet power that filled the space between them. It wasn't the kind of power that came from a uniform or a badge. It was the kind of power that came from experience, from years of making decisions that could change lives. As a judge, he had seen the darkest corners of human nature, heard the most desperate pleas for mercy, and dealt out sentences that shaped destinies. But today, he wasn't in a courtroom. Today, he was just a man pulled over on a street, trying to understand why he was being treated as if he didn't belong. He had seen it before, the suspicion, the way some people looked at him as if his very presence was a threat. It wasn't new to him, not by a long shot. He had navigated a world that seemed designed to remind him of his place, of the way people who looked like him were often viewed. But that didn't mean he had to accept it. And as the officer struggled to decide his next move, the judge could feel the subtle shift in power. He could sense the officer's internal conflict, the way he wasn't quite sure how to handle someone who wasn't acting like the other black men he'd stopped. There were so many layers to this interaction, and the judge could feel every one of them pressing in. The officer finally made the call. His voice was strained as he spoke into the radio, trying to sound authoritative. I need to run a background check on this driver. The judge heard the words but didn't react. He simply remained silent, his hands at his sides, his expression unchanged. He could have intervened, could have said something to challenge the officer's authority, but he didn't. He knew that sometimes silence was more powerful than any words could be. The seconds stretched into what felt like hours as the officer waited for a response. The silence hung heavily in the air, punctuated only by the distant hum of traffic and the occasional chirp of a nearby bird. It was as though the entire world had slowed down, waiting to see what would happen next. And then the officer's radio crackled to life, the dispatcher's voice sharp and clear. We've got a match. The driver is who he says he is. Nothing unusual on file. The officer stood frozen for a moment, his mind racing. The name on the license was legitimate. There was no reason to continue the stop. But something in the pit of his stomach told him to press further, to keep going, to dig deeper. It wasn't just about a traffic violation anymore. It was about something more. Something that didn't sit right. He cleared his throat again, his voice shaking slightly. All right, I'm going to let you off with a warning, he said, his tone clipped. But I need you to be more careful next time. Understand? The judge nodded once, slowly. His gaze was steady, his lips a tight line. He hadn't been expecting an apology, and he certainly hadn't been expecting any kind of sympathy. He knew how the system worked. He knew that this officer, just like so many others, had been trained to view him as a threat before he'd even opened his mouth. But he also knew something the officer didn't: the game wasn't over yet. The officer took a small step back, still unsure of how to end the encounter. There was a tension in the air that neither of them could ignore. It felt like a standoff, even though either man had raised his voice or made any dramatic gestures. The power dynamics were shifting, and it wasn't clear who would come out on top. The officer gave a stiff nod, signaling that the interaction was over, but the judge didn't move. He stayed in place, his hands still at his sides. There was something about the officer's discomfort that gave him pause. The officer was not acting like a man who was sure of himself, and that made the judge wonder. "What's your name, officer?" the judge asked, his voice low but firm. The officer blinked, caught off guard by the question. For a moment, he wondered why the judge would ask such a thing. What difference did it make? But then, realizing that he had already stepped into uncharted territory, he answered. "It's Officer Reynolds." The judge's eyes narrowed slightly, and the officer couldn't tell if he was trying to assess the situation or just making note of his name. Either way, the judge seemed to file it away in his mind, the way someone might store away a piece of important information for later use. "You don't recognize my name, do you?" the judge asked, his voice quiet but carrying a weight that made the officer feel uneasy. Reynolds' brow furrowed. "Should I?" The judge let the silence stretch for a few moments before he spoke again, his words deliberate, each one landing like a small punch. "I'm the judge who sentenced your brother 2 years ago. The one you thought was guilty of everything they said he was." The officer's stomach dropped, a cold shiver running down his spine. The name. He remembered the trial, the media frenzy, the anger that had surrounded the verdict. His brother had been convicted of a crime he swore he didn't commit, but the evidence had been damning. Reynolds felt a wave of shame wash over him. He had never been able to reconcile the outcome of that case, never fully accepted the judgment handed down by the court. But hearing those words from the judge, his brother's name, that case struck him in a way he hadn't anticipated. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The judge had just laid bare a truth that the officer wasn't ready to face. His hands felt clammy, his heart pounding in his chest. And in that moment, it became clear, the power dynamics had shifted yet again. The judge wasn't just a man being pulled over. He wasn't just a name on a driver's license. He was a force that had already shaped the officer's life in ways that neither of them could escape. The officer took a step back, suddenly aware of how little control he truly had. He felt as though the ground was slipping beneath his feet, and he wasn't sure how to stand firm again. The judge's gaze remained fixed on him, unwavering, knowing that the officer was on the edge of something far bigger than either of them could understand. And as the judge finally turned to leave, he spoke one last time, his voice a quiet but unmistakable command, "We'll meet again, officer. But next time, you'll know exactly who I am." The officer watched him disappear into the night, his mind still reeling from the weight of the encounter. He wasn't sure if he had just witnessed the beginning of something he couldn't control, or if he had narrowly avoided a disaster. Either way, one thing was certain, this was far from over. The night air was still, almost too still, as Officer Reynolds sat in his car, the engine humming beneath him. The judge's words echoed in his mind, over and over again, each repetition growing louder, more insistent. "We'll meet again, officer. But next time, you'll know exactly who I am." His hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. He had never felt so exposed. His brother's conviction was something he had buried deep, something he thought he had reconciled with. But now, with the judge's casual mention of it, that old wound had reopened, raw and unhealed. It was like being thrown back into the chaos of that trial, back to the courtroom where his brother had stood, angry and defiant, and where Reynolds had sat helpless in the background, watching the system grind away at him. But that wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part was realizing that the judge, the very man who had delivered the sentence that had torn his family apart, was now standing before him, calm and unbothered. It felt like a twist of fate, or maybe even a test, but Reynolds didn't know if he was ready for it. He reached for the radio again, needing something to distract him, anything to steady his racing thoughts. Unit 23 to dispatch, requesting a follow-up on case 2458, he said, his voice tight. The radio crackled, and the dispatcher's voice came through, a faint, distant noise against the pounding in his head. Case 2458, Officer Reynolds? I'll have to pull up the file for you. The officer closed his eyes for a moment, leaning back in his seat. The case was a blur, a high-profile mess that had consumed his family and his city. His brother had been accused of murder, a crime he swore he didn't commit. There was evidence, yes, but it had always felt off. The way it was gathered, the way it was presented, it was as if the system had already made up its mind, and his brother's fate had already been sealed before the trial even began. He could hear the rustling of papers in the background as the dispatcher retrieved the file. I've got it here. Case details confirm your brother's conviction, sentenced to 15 years. What are you looking for, officer? Reynolds swallowed hard. I need to know who presided over the case, he said, his voice a little quieter than before. The dispatcher hesitated. That would be Judge Langston. Judge Langston. The name felt heavy, like a stone dropped into his stomach. He had always known the judge's name, of course. Everyone in the department did. But hearing it now, in this context, made his blood run cold. The judge wasn't just a figure of authority, he was a man who had shaped the course of Reynolds' family, a man whose decisions had shattered his world in ways he hadn't fully understood at the time. Reynolds sat there for a long moment, staring out into the empty street, his mind spinning. He couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play here, something that went far beyond a routine traffic stop. The encounter with Judge Langston earlier had left him with more questions than answers. Why had the judge, with his calm, almost impervious demeanor, chosen to bring up the case? The more he thought about it, the more unsettling the entire interaction became. The judge had said nothing that could directly incriminate him, yet he had left an undeniable mark on Reynolds' psyche. There had been a certain knowing in his gaze, a feeling that he was toying with him, as if he were testing the officer in some way. But why? Meanwhile, across town, Judge Langston was sitting in his study, the low hum of the streetlights outside filtering through the windows. He had been preparing for the following day's cases, but his mind kept drifting back to the encounter with Reynolds. It had been a simple traffic stop, or so it seemed, but there was something about the officer that had piqued his interest. Something in the way he hesitated, in the way his hand had trembled slightly when he handed over the driver's license. Langston had seen the signs before. The tension, the uncertainty, it was something he had become all too familiar with over the years. He knew the weight of a man's decisions, how each one rippled outward and affected not only his life but the lives of those around him. And he knew that Reynolds was carrying a burden, one that Langston wasn't sure the officer even fully understood. The judge leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. His thoughts were swirling, and yet there was a strange sense of satisfaction in him. This wasn't just about a random traffic stop. It was about something far more personal, far more dangerous. He remembered the trial all those years ago, the conviction of Reynolds' brother, and the way it had shaken not just the officer but the entire department. He knew that Reynolds had been caught in the web of guilt, too, unable to fully reconcile the outcome. There had always been whispers, rumors that the case had been mishandled, that perhaps someone had used it to make an example of the accused. Langston had heard the stories, had even questioned the evidence himself. But in the end, his decision had been made. Justice, as it was called, had to be served. And that meant following the letter of the law, no matter how messy or flawed it appeared to be. But now, standing before Reynolds in that quiet moment, Langston couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing, something deep and unsettling. Reynolds wasn't the same man he had been back then. He had grown into something more, something that Langston couldn't quite put his finger on. And yet, despite the growing sense of unease, Langston couldn't help but feel a certain thrill. This was not just about one case. This was about a reckoning, a long-awaited collision between two men on opposite sides of a broken system. Langston had always prided himself on being in control, on wielding his authority with precision. But the officer had thrown him off balance in a way that he couldn't ignore. For the first time in a long time, Langston felt the weight of his own choices, the weight of the power he had used, the power he had handed over to others. He had sentenced Reynolds' brother, yes, but he had never fully understood the consequences of that decision. Maybe it was time to understand. The next day, Reynolds reported for his shift as usual, but the nagging feeling wouldn't leave him. Every time he walked into the precinct, he felt the weight of the past pressing down on him. The case, his brother's conviction, the shadow of Judge Langston, it all followed him. And it wasn't just the judge that was on his mind. The entire department had been whispering about the stop. There were rumors that Reynolds had been visibly shaken, that he had hesitated. The officer's reputation was on the line, and he knew it. The last thing he needed was for people to start questioning his integrity. But what could he do? How could he explain the way the judge had looked at him, the way he had stood so calm and unshaken? Reynolds couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that there was more to the encounter than a simple misunderstanding. He had to get to the bottom of it. The tension continued to build, like a storm on the horizon. The weight of the past, the uncertainty of the present, and the looming reckoning between Reynolds and Langston, it was all coming to a head. Neither man knew it yet, but their lives were about to collide in ways either of them could have anticipated. And as the day wore on, it became clearer that this was no longer just about justice or power. It was about a deeper, more personal conflict, one that neither of them could avoid for much longer. The days that followed felt heavier than usual for Officer Reynolds. He couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease that had settled deep within him since the encounter with Judge Langston. Every time he stepped into his patrol car, he felt as if he was walking into a storm. It was like the weight of his past, his brother's conviction, and the judge's quiet, unnerving gaze was suffocating. At hand patrolling, writing reports, keeping up with the usual demands of the job, but his thoughts kept circling back to Langston. It wasn't just the trial that haunted him. It wasn't just the conviction of his brother, or the questions that had never been answered. It was the judge's words, calm and measured, like a warning he didn't yet fully understand. "We'll meet again, officer. But next time, you'll know exactly who I am." Those words kept replaying in his mind like a broken record. The whispers in the precinct hadn't helped either. It was clear that everyone knew about the stop, even though Reynolds hadn't spoken a word to anyone about it. The rumor mill was in full swing, and people were beginning to question whether the officer had been compromised by his personal history with the judge. But Reynolds couldn't afford to care about that, not now. He had a more pressing concern: how to confront Langston and get the answers that had been eluding him. One evening, Reynolds found himself staring at the files from his brother's case again. He had pulled them up earlier, thinking that he could find something new, some shred of evidence that might explain the conviction, something that could offer him peace. But instead, all he found was the same cold, bureaucratic language, the same harsh sentences that had been handed down by a system that seemed to care more about closing cases than about the truth. His brother had been sentenced to 15 years, but Reynolds was starting to wonder if the case had been nothing more than a setup from the start. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his reverie. It was a message from his partner, and the tone was urgent. "Meet me at the diner. I think I found something about Langston." Reynolds' heart skipped a beat. He grabbed his jacket and headed out the door without a second thought. As he drove through the streets, the city seemed darker, the weight of the night pressing in on him. The hum of the engine was the only sound, and it felt like the world around him had gone silent, waiting for something to break the tension. His thoughts were racing. What had his partner found? What could possibly explain the way Langston had looked at him that night? When he arrived at the diner, His partner was already seated in a corner booth, looking over his shoulder as if he were expecting someone. Reynolds slid into the seat across from him, his eyes scanning the room quickly before focusing on the man in front of him. "I don't have much time," his partner said, his voice low. "But I found something. Something big. You're not going to believe it." Reynolds leaned in, his stomach tightening. "What is it?" The partner hesitated, as if weighing the decision to go forward. "Langston's been involved in some shady dealings. There are rumors about his connections to people outside the law, people with a lot of power. He's been under investigation for a while now, but it's been kept quiet. The thing is, your brother's case? It wasn't just about a murder charge. There's more to it." Reynolds felt his pulse quicken. "What do you mean? What's more to it?" "Langston. He might have been using that case to cover his tracks," his partner said, sliding a folder across the table. "This is a list of people he's been meeting with, connections that go back years. But the real kicker? He was involved in a case where evidence was tampered with, back in the same year your brother was convicted. It's all linked together somehow." Reynolds picked up the folder, his hands trembling slightly as he flipped through the documents. Each page felt like a door opening to a new, more dangerous reality. The more he read, the more it all started to make sense, and the more terrifying it became. Langston had been playing a long game, and Reynolds' brother had been nothing more than a pawn in it. "What does this mean for me?" Reynolds asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He could feel the walls closing in. "I don't know," his partner replied, looking over his shoulder nervously. "But whatever it is, it's bigger than you think. You need to be careful. Langston's not just a judge anymore, he's got a whole network behind him, and they don't take kindly to threats." Reynolds felt his world tilt on its axis. The man he had once respected, the judge who had sentenced his brother, was now a figure wrapped in shadows, his power extending far beyond the courthouse. What had started as a personal vendetta now felt like a much larger conspiracy, one that had deep roots in the very system Reynolds had sworn to uphold. The rest of the night was a blur. Reynolds couldn't shake the images from the folder, the connections, the hidden agendas. Everything he thought he knew about his life, about the law, about justice, was crumbling before him. He didn't know who to trust anymore, or even what side he was supposed to be on. He wasn't sure if he could still. The next day, Reynolds tried to carry on as if nothing had changed. He went through the motions, responding to calls, handling traffic stops, and dealing with the everyday chaos of the streets. But every time he passed a courthouse, every time he saw the familiar face of Judge Langston in the media, it felt like the ground beneath him was shifting. He had to make a decision. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine. He couldn't just let this go. His brother's life had been destroyed by this system, by this judge, and now he was part of the same system. He was a part of the same web, and he couldn't ignore it any longer. Reynolds had made up his mind. He was going to confront Langston this time, face to face. There would be no more games, no more subtle threats. He needed answers. He needed to understand why his brother had been sacrificed. That evening, Reynolds found himself standing outside Langston's home. The city was quiet around him, the streets empty as the shadows stretched long and dark. He had no backup, no plan B. There was nothing standing between him and the judge now. His heart was pounding, and his thoughts were racing. He knew this could be the moment that everything changed, but he couldn't back down. With a deep breath, he walked up to the front door and rang the bell. Inside, Langston was sitting in his study, a glass of whiskey in hand, when he heard the doorbell. He wasn't surprised. It was a visit he had been expecting. He had known it was only a matter of time before Reynolds came knocking, but he wasn't sure how the officer would handle it. As he stood up, setting his drink down, he felt the weight of everything he had done pressing on him. The years of secrets, of deals made in the dark, were catching up with him. And now, the officer was at his door. The moment had arrived. Reynolds stood frozen at the doorstep, his hands still on the doorbell. The quiet of the night pressed in on him, and the weight of his decision felt heavier than ever. He had come this far, there was no turning back now. But just as he began to think he might have made a mistake, the door creaked open, and there was Judge Langston, standing in the doorway with his usual calm demeanor. His face betrayed nothing, but there was something in his eyes that made Reynolds feel like the ground beneath him had shifted. "I've been expecting you," Langston said, his voice steady, almost too steady. He stepped aside, opening the door wider, and gestured for Reynolds to come in. For a moment, Reynolds hesitated. The house was quiet, eerily so, with only the faint glow of lamps casting long shadows across the polished floors. It was nothing like the cold, sterile environment of the courtroom. This was Langston's personal domain, a place where the judge controlled everything. And Reynolds couldn't help but feel a sense of unease creeping up his spine as he stepped inside. As soon as he crossed the threshold, the door clicked shut behind him. Reynolds tensed. He had expected a confrontation, but this felt different. It wasn't just about his brother anymore. It wasn't just about justice. Something much darker was unfolding, something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Langston led him into a large study, lined with bookshelves and expensive artwork. The judge walked over to a bar cart, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey with smooth, practiced movements. He didn't ask if Reynolds wanted one, it was clear that he didn't need to. There was an unspoken understanding here, an almost eerie familiarity. Reynolds couldn't help but wonder if Langston had anticipated this moment, this very visit, for years. Langston handed Reynolds a glass, his eyes glinting in the dim light. "To justice," he said, his tone deliberate. But the word felt empty, hollow in that moment. Reynolds didn't touch the glass. He stood there, trying to steady his breath, the anger rising within him. "I'm not here for a drink, Langston. I'm here for answers." The judge didn't seem bothered by the confrontation. He leaned back in his chair, crossing one leg over the other. "You think you've come to confront me about your brother, don't you? About the case, about the conviction." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it, just a knowing, almost sinister curve of his lips. Reynolds felt his pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" Langston's eyes locked onto his. "You've been digging, haven't you?" "I'm impressed. But you're missing the bigger picture. This isn't about your brother, not really. This is about power. This is about control. And the people who are pulling the strings." Reynolds felt a cold chill run through him. He had suspected something larger was at play, but hearing it spoken aloud made the realization even more terrifying. "Who are you talking about? What's really going on here?" Langston chuckled softly, setting his glass down. "You really don't understand, do you, officer? On your own family's tragedy that you've failed to see the web that's been woven around you. Around all of us. Your brother's case? It wasn't a random act of injustice. It was orchestrated." Reynolds' head spun. He was starting to put the pieces together, but the picture Langston was painting was too complex, too far-reaching. "You're saying my brother was part of some bigger plan?" Langston leaned forward, his expression darkening. "Not just your brother. This goes deeper than you can possibly imagine. Your brother was just one pawn in a much larger game. And you're next." The words hung in the air, heavy with threat. Reynolds felt the blood drain from his face. The room seemed to close in around him. He had always known that Langston was more than just a judge, but hearing him admit it, hearing him imply that there was some larger conspiracy at play, made his skin crawl. Before Reynolds could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway outside the study. A door creaked open, and a voice distinctly unfamiliar called out. "Langston, is everything all right in here?" Reynolds tensed, instinctively reaching for his sidearm. But Langston raised a hand, his face showing no trace of concern. "It's fine, Justine. Just a small chat with the officer." Reynolds turned toward the doorway, his eyes narrowing. Another figure stepped into the study. It was a woman, tall and composed, with a sharp, calculating gaze. She was dressed in a dark suit, her presence commanding and authoritative, but there was something unsettling about her calm demeanor. Reynolds' heart skipped a beat. He had never seen her before, but there was a coldness about her that made him uneasy. He could feel the tension in the room ratcheting up another notch. "Officer Reynolds," she said, her voice smooth but carrying an unmistakable edge. "I'd suggest you leave before you get yourself too deep into something you don't understand. Things are bigger than you realize." Her words struck him like a punch to the gut. His mind raced. Who was she? And what did she mean by that? He turned back to Langston, searching for any sign of a reaction, but the judge's expression remained unreadable, as if he was merely observing a scene unfold before him. Reynolds swallowed hard. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely steady. Langston's lips curled into a smile, and he stood up from his chair, placing his glass down on the desk. "This," he said, his voice low and almost playful, "is where things get complicated. Justine here works for someone you'd rather not meet. But if you're determined to dig into things you don't understand, you'll soon find yourself caught in the crossfire." Justine's eyes locked onto Reynolds. There was no hint of kindness in her gaze, just cold, calculated certainty. "I'm sure you have a lot of questions," she said. "But some things are better left buried. You'd be wise to forget about all of this, your brother, the case, Langston. Forget it all." But Reynolds wasn't ready to back down. His brother had suffered, and now he knew he had stumbled onto something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. He couldn't turn away now, not after everything he had learned, not after seeing how far the web stretched. "I can't forget," Reynolds said, his voice steady, though his insides were churning. "I need to know the truth. I have to." Langston's smile faded, and he exchanged a brief, knowing look with Justine. Reynolds could feel the air growing heavier, as if something was about to break wide open. But before he could react, Justine's hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising force. "You don't get it," she said, her voice a hiss. "You think you're fighting for justice. You think you're uncovering the truth. But you're not. You're already too deep." The tension was palpable, thickening with every passing second. Reynolds could feel the weight of her words, the warning they carried. And yet, despite everything, he couldn't stop. He had already crossed the line. The question now was how far he was willing to go to uncover the truth and whether he could survive the game that had already begun. The grip on Reynolds' wrist tightened, and for a moment, he was paralyzed by the cold, unyielding force of Justine's hand. Her words hung in the air, her warning echoing in his mind. But in the pit of his stomach, he knew he couldn't turn back. He had to know the truth, no matter the cost. "I'm not going anywhere," Reynolds said, his voice steady, his eyes meeting hers with a quiet resolve. The tension in the room thickened, and for the first time, Langston's calm facade wavered just slightly. The judge didn't look angry, no, he looked almost resigned, like a man who had already foreseen this confrontation and knew it was inevitable. Justine, however, didn't let go. Her gaze was. But there was something else in her eyes, something that hinted at an underlying desperation. Maybe she didn't want him to dig deeper, but maybe she was starting to realize that it was too late to stop him. "You're making a mistake, officer," she said, her voice low, but there was a hint of something else in it now, uncertainty, even fear. "You have no idea what you're up against." Reynolds barely registered her words. He had one mission now, to break free from this web of lies and find out how deep it went. His mind raced back to his brother, to everything that had happened, to Langston's calculated moves. The judge had manipulated the case, used his power and influence to ensure his brother's conviction, and for what? To cover up something far darker? "I'm not here for threats," Reynolds replied, his pulse quickening. "I'm here for the truth. You can either give it to me, or I'll find it myself." With that, he twisted his arm, breaking free from Justine's grip. She didn't fight him, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of frustration. Langston, standing quietly in the background, didn't say a word. It was as if he were watching a game unfold, one that was well beyond Reynolds' understanding. For a moment, the room was silent. Reynolds could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, as if everything he had worked for, the truth, justice, his brother's future, was hanging in the balance. Then, without warning, Langston spoke. His voice was slow, deliberate, but there was a hardness in it that sent a chill down Reynolds' spine. "You really don't know, do you?" Langston said. "You think you're the hero in this story, that you're uncovering some great conspiracy. But you've been blind this entire time. It's not just about your brother. It's about everything you've ever believed in. The system you're trying to expose? It's been controlling you from the very start." Reynolds felt his breath catch in his throat. "What do you mean?" "I'm not part of this." Langston chuckled darkly. "No? You're the perfect pawn, officer. The perfect tool. You've been played just as easily as anyone else. Did you really think that your brother's conviction was just a random mistake? No, it was orchestrated. You think it was about a corrupt judge? No, it's about something far more powerful. Something you can't even begin to comprehend." The words struck Reynolds like a punch to the gut. He had thought he was uncovering a story about injustice, about a man who had used his position for personal gain. But what Langston was saying was something entirely different. There was something far more insidious at play, something Reynolds wasn't sure he was prepared to face. "And you think you can just walk away from all of this?" Langston continued. "You're in deeper than you realize. You're already tangled in it, Reynolds. There's no way out." Reynolds' mind was racing. He couldn't let Langston win. He couldn't let his brother's conviction be in vain, couldn't let the corruption go unchecked. But Langston's words were starting to make a twisted kind of sense. Had he been manipulated from the start? Had he been unknowingly playing into their hands? Just then, Justine spoke again, her voice tinged with something that almost sounded like regret. "Langston's right, you know. You've been part of this game from the beginning. You're not the only one who's been lied to. There's more at play here than you understand. And now, you're just another pawn in a much larger scheme." Reynolds' stomach twisted. He thought back to everything he'd uncovered, all the pieces he'd tried to fit together. Had he been so blinded by his need for revenge, for justice, that he had missed the bigger picture? Had he been led into this trap by forces far more powerful than he could imagine? Langston's smile returned, but it was cold, calculating. "You're out of your depth, officer. I tried to warn you." Reynolds' mind was spinning, but he refused to back down. He couldn't let himself be another casualty of this twisted game. "I'll stop you. Whatever it takes." Langston's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Reynolds saw a flicker of something more dangerous in the judge's expression. "You really think you can stop me?" Langston said. "You've already lost." And just as those words left Langston's lips, something happened. The lights flickered, then went out entirely, plunging the room into darkness. Reynolds' heart pounded in his chest as he instinctively reached for his weapon, but before he could even draw it, a loud bang echoed through the study, followed by a sharp, searing pain in his side. He gasped, his body going cold as he staggered, trying to stay on his feet. The room spun around him. Everything felt distant, muffled, as if he were submerged underwater. But through the haze of pain, he could hear Langston's voice again, softer this time, almost disappointed. I told you. It was never about. Reynolds collapsed to the ground, the world around him blurring. He could barely hold on to consciousness, but as his vision began to fade, one final thought crossed his mind: who had just shot him? The last thing he saw was Langston standing over him, his expression unreadable. Then, everything went black. When Reynolds woke up, he was in a hospital bed, the faint beeping of a heart monitor keeping time with his rapidly accelerating pulse. His body felt heavy, his side wrapped in bandages, but the pain wasn't enough to keep him from trying to sit up. He was alive barely, but alive. And as his vision cleared, a nurse rushed to his side speaking quickly, but her words didn't register. It wasn't the nurse he was looking for. It was the figure standing in the doorway of the room. Reynolds' breath caught when he saw who it was: his brother. But it wasn't just his brother standing there. There was something different about him, something off. As his brother's eyes met his, the smile that spread across his face was colder than anything Reynolds had ever seen. You're still here, his brother said, his voice eerily calm. I was hoping you'd wake up. Reynolds' heart pounded in his chest as his eyes locked onto his brother, standing in the doorway. For a moment, everything felt unreal. His body was sluggish, still recovering from the gunshot wound, but his mind was racing. This was his brother, the same one who had been wronged, the one he had vowed to protect and fight for. And yet, something about the way he stood there, calm and almost too composed, made Reynolds' stomach churn. You shouldn't be here, Reynolds managed, his voice hoarse and weak. He tried to sit up, but the pain in his side flared, and he winced, collapsing back onto the pillow. His brother didn't move for a long moment. Then, slowly, he stepped into the room, the door clicking softly behind him. His eyes never left Reynolds, and the faintest trace of a smile tugged at the corners of his lips. But it wasn't the smile of a man relieved to see his sibling alive. No, it was something colder, something that didn't belong. You're still surprised, aren't you? His brother said, his voice smooth, controlled. I always knew this would happen eventually. Reynolds blinked, trying to process what he was hearing. What? What are you talking about? His brother's expression darkened. I've been watching you, Mark. Every move you've made since you started digging into the case. You think this is about justice, about right and wrong, but it's never been about that. You've been chasing the wrong thing. Reynolds felt a cold wave wash over him. His brother had been a victim in all of this, or so he had thought. He had always believed his brother's conviction had been the result of corruption, a deep, systemic issue within the justice system that had destroyed lives. But now, hearing those words, seeing that cold smile, he realized how little he truly understood. Why didn't you tell me? Reynolds asked, his voice breaking. Why didn't you say anything? His brother chuckled softly, almost as if he were humoring him. Because I didn't need you to. You've been useful. A perfect distraction. Every move you made, every step you took toward uncovering the truth, it was all part of the plan. The words hit Reynolds like a punch to the gut. He felt nauseous, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was hearing. No, you're wrong, Reynolds said, shaking his head. You're not part of this. I did this for you, for us. His brother's eyes flickered, but only for a moment. For us? He repeated, his tone almost mocking. That's the problem, Mark. You're still thinking in terms of family, of loyalty. You've always been blinded by that. You were never meant to be the hero. You were always just a pawn. The room seemed to close in around Reynolds. The world felt as though it were spinning, tilting beneath him, and he could barely grasp onto reality. His brother wasn't the person he thought he was. The man standing in front of him was something else entirely, someone who had played him all along. "You're a part of this too, aren't you?" Reynolds whispered, his voice barely audible. "You've been working with Langston." "With them?" His brother's smile widened. "Langston? Oh, he's just a small piece of the puzzle. But yes, I've been working with the people who pulled the strings. People you wouldn't even begin to comprehend. They're the ones who really run things, run this whole system. And you? You've been nothing more than a useful idiot. But now we're done." Reynolds could hardly believe his ears. His brother, his own flesh and blood, had been a part of the very system they had both railed against. The corruption, the manipulation, the false justice, it had all been part of a game that his brother had willingly participated in. And now, standing here, in this sterile... "You're lying," Reynolds said, his voice trembling with a mix of disbelief and anger. "You're lying to me." "No," his brother replied coldly, "I'm telling you the truth. You should have never tried to play this game, Mark. You should have left well enough alone. Now look where you are." Reynolds' eyes burned with unshed tears, but he blinked them away. His brother had sold out. He had sold everything, his loyalty, his morals, everything. And Reynolds had been too blind to see it. But there was something else in his brother's eyes now. Something darker. A glimmer of satisfaction, maybe. As if the conversation had been leading to this moment all along. Reynolds' mind raced. What was he supposed to do now? How could he confront the man who had once been his closest ally, the one person he thought he could always count on? "I don't understand," Reynolds said, his voice barely above a whisper. "How could you do this?" His brother's gaze softened, but only for a second. Then he stepped closer, leaning in as if he were about to reveal a secret. "Because I'm done being a pawn," he said, his voice low, almost hypnotic. "I'm the one who's in control now. And you? You've been played. All of this? It's just the beginning." Reynolds' mind reeled. His brother was more involved in this than he could have ever imagined. And worse still, he was prepared to destroy everything that Reynolds had worked for, to throw him under the bus without a second thought. For a moment, Reynolds felt utterly powerless, trapped in a game where the rules had always been rigged against him. But even in the face of betrayal, one thing was clear: he couldn't give up. Not now. Not after everything. He had come too far, fought too hard, to just let it end like this. There had to be a way to turn this around. Just as Reynolds began to think he might have some sort of plan, the door to the room opened again. This time, it wasn't just his brother who stood in the doorway. It was Langston. The judge's presence seemed to fill the room, an almost tangible weight pressing down on Reynolds' chest. He looked over at his brother, and then back at Reynolds with a cold, calculating gaze. "Well, well," Langston said, his voice rich with satisfaction. "It seems you've made quite a mess of things, officer." Reynolds' head was spinning. Langston was in on this, too. But now, there was something different about the way the judge stood there. He wasn't just smug, there was something triumphant in his posture, as if he had orchestrated all of this from the start, and now everything was falling into place. "Langston," Reynolds said through gritted teeth, trying to steady his breathing. "You're part of this too, aren't you? All this time, you've been pulling the strings." Langston smiled. It was the kind of smile that made Reynolds feel small, insignificant. "I've been pulling the strings for a long time, officer. Long before you ever knew what was happening. And now, it's time for you to leave the game." Reynolds' pulse quickened as he tried to process everything. The world he had fought for, the justice he had believed in, it was all a lie. He wasn't just a pawn in their game. He was nothing. But then, as the room seemed to close in around him, something shifted in Reynolds. A spark of defiance, something deep within him, lit up. Maybe he had been played, maybe he had been used, but he wasn't going down without a fight. He looked up at his brother, at Langston, at the twisted world they had all built, and for the first time, Reynolds knew what he had to do. It wasn't just about exposing them anymore. It wasn't just about bringing them to justice. It was about saving himself. He would burn it all down if he had to. And in that final, desperate moment, he realized that the game wasn't over yet. The rules might have been set, but he was going to rewrite them. As the door clicked shut behind Langston and his brother, sealing him in the dark, Reynolds closed his eyes. The battle was far from over, and the ending was still unwritten.